long list of questions. I don't know if you had a chance to look them over.
I looked them over, but I think lots of them are implicitly or implied in other questions. So
Okay.
if we explain the background, I think will explain itself, so to speak. Okay.
So
it's
I
fine.
feel like, yeah, you've just said that we have to do a little background check. So the first question that we have is actually a background check on the significance of Bush 2003 order and the Biden extension in 2024, considering many aspects such as military, security, but also economic. Do you have any, can you contextualize that and give your opinion on it, please?
This is probably the most important executive order issued regarding Iraq, and the background of it was during the 90s, there were several executive orders under the Clinton administration really punishing Iraq. I mean, in the context of the sanctions against Iraq, in 1996, there was the oil for, oil for food program. So Iraq was forced, well, not forced, had no choice, more or less, to sell oil, and the money would go into a fund, and that fund, Iraq could submit requests like, we want this and this to buy. So the UN would go do the purchasing from the Iraqi money, and then things are shipped to Iraq to lessen the effect of the sanctions at the time. That fund, when Saddam was overthrown, was transferred to Iraq. Security Council resolution, I think 1483, removed the sanctions, most of them, and more or less transferred this fund. And they wanted a way for this fund to operate. So there was some UN monitoring, but then Iraq, was at the time, I think, under Bremer, because Bremer was representing the Iraqi government, so on and so forth. So the executive order, this executive order came in this context to protect Iraq's right to transfer money, to use the money, because there were judicial cases. There were lots of, okay, let me explain this differently. Okay, two types of problems Iraq had as a result of sanctions. The one type was there were lots of debt against Iraq because of the Kuwait war and that comes from the Iraq-Iran war. That part, the United States played a significant role in fixing what's called the Paris Accord or the Paris Understanding. Or James Baker went and basically asked nations to release Iraq from these official sovereign debts. And I think all countries did 80% of it, except Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, which maintained their debt, but they didn't accrue interest on them. It's a political issue Iraq will have to solve later. So that problem is solved because the point was to enable Iraq economically to have a good start. And these debts were significant. But there was the other kind of debt that the United States couldn't do anything about, which is debts by companies that went through their national court system in order to ask Iraq for reparations because of the Kuwait war. They lost money this, there, so on and so forth. We don't know how many of these, but most of these were more or less because Iraq under Saddam didn't respond to these. So there's a court case about this, this company lost, I don't know, $500 million. They asked for this amount. So the Iraqi embassy in France or in India, wherever it is, didn't go and respond and attend the court or hire an attorney to say, no, this is not true. No, this is blah, blah, blah. if they have done, this problem would have been much, much less severe now. And because it didn't attend these sessions, didn't even acknowledge the court, or these companies got what they wanted. So you wanted $500 million, you probably got, I don't know, 450 or something. We don't know, because Iraq hasn't listed all of these. So all of these are a final verdict, final sentence was issued. The appeal period is over, because if this was given in 1995, and now what? We're 20 something. So Iraq even didn't appeal. They just didn't care. Okay. Yeah. And so these are final, orders, sentences, and basically include that whenever Iraq has sovereign funds in its name, these funds are frozen in order to fulfill these reparation sentences, more or less. So it happened in Italy, I think, 2016?
Yes.
Iraq had, I don't know, $30 million or whatever, or 40, 60. And then, the Italian government, because of so that's the context. So this order protects this money from these sentences, court sentences, so on and so forth. Until Iraq fixes this issue, which is it lists all of these cases, gets into negotiation with these companies, offer them something. This has happened in the past with other countries. Until Iraq does this, which is it's not huge, it's a bit challenging, but we have a government that is in disarray, a state that is in disarray, wouldn't be able to do this, or they don't have the political will. So Iraq needs this order in order for the money to basically transfer, to go through the system, because it is American money, more or less. Mm-hmm. The order makes it more or less American money, and it gets renewed every year around May. All U.S. administrations did this almost as a matter of routine. I don't think Iraqis care or know. And it's only when it stops working, they will know.
Oh, thank you for this great answer.
So our next question is, in terms of Iraq's current national debt and obligations to international foreign firms, what challenges arise if the orders are not renewed?
Actually, we don't have full accuracy on how this will play out, simply because we don't know the cases. Iraq needs to hire an international law company to basically catalog these, know how many cases, the reparations that these national courts have ordered, so on and so forth. And it might not be a significant number. It might be 2 billion, it might be $500 million, but whatever it is the issue is not really the amount itself. Okay. The issue is freezing the accounts until you get the money, until the reparation is paid. So we simply don't know. It could be in the hundreds, the cases. This requires lots of institutional work on the part of Iraq, giving power to a certain sort of body. It's usual an international firm would do this. Iraq doesn't have the capacity to get into negotiation. So you get all of these together, and then you offer them 40% of the amount of money. You come up with some sort of deal. You offer them, incentives to work in Iraq, and just a whole number of approaches. So these would basically give up on their cases. They say, we got what we wanted. Iraq is, the restriction is lifted. But if there is no protection from the U.S., there will be the shock, my understanding, and nobody can give you an accurate answer because we don't know how many of these. There could be, you freeze 2 or 3 Iraqi accounts, it has a ripple effect on the economy. Everybody is scared, and the economy functions also by feelings, not only, you know, hard facts on the ground. So do you want to try this and receive a shock? And then, you know, everything starts, you know, going downhill. I don't think anybody wants this. So we don't know, but I think it will be significant until we absorb the shock and understand, you know, how much Iraq owes and the ways to go around it or negotiate, you know, itself out of it. But I think it would hurt the Iraqi economy. It would hurt, you know, Iraq's financial standing, and it will send shock waves through the system in Iraq.
And on that matter, to what extent does the U.S. presence in Iraq impact Iraq's development, and do you perceive it as beneficial or detrimental?
You mean like having this order, is it,
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Because of this order, the U.S. tend to be much more present in Iraq. And so in an economic perspective, does it impact the Iraqis' development, the country's development? Is it for you beneficial for Iraq, or it is like have negative effects?
No, it is beneficial for Iraq because its money is protected. Iraq can get into deals with companies, can send them money through the financial system, so on and so forth. It is beneficial for Iraq, but I mean, this raises another problem in Iraq, is that does Iraq have economic development?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, does it deal really with like real companies? Is it building something serious? Is it, so it benefits Iraq. Has Iraq made full use of it? No, I don't think it made full use of it. I mean, Iraq needs not to need this protection order, okay? Because it's a specter, it's something, it's a sword over your head. And if Iraq gets in trouble with the US, the US stops this protection, it would be in a much, much worse situation than it is now.
Okay, and outside of the US, would you be able to contextualize for us the Chinese influence and in terms of their development projects in Iraq?
Yeah, I mean, this is one failure by Iraq because, I mean, the Chinese normally work the system much better in Iraq than the Americans. The Americans have, or Western companies have specific standards. You know, they cannot accept bribes, they cannot give bribes because they would be liable to laws in their own countries. Which is not the case with the Chinese. So the Chinese work out the system much better. They don't, you know, they don't have serious anti-corruption laws. And I think the political class in Iraq prefers to work with the Chinese, you know, because the deals and back and forth. And the American companies, Western companies mostly, in the oil field, that was the most important field they worked on. Mostly, I wouldn't say all of them, most of them have left Iraq. They have left KRG, they have left Iraq in the south because it's just poor management of contracts. The benefit, particularly in KRG, didn't turn out as was expected. You know, they were thinking of huge amounts of, you know, reserve in terms of oil, and this didn't turn out to be true. So they went to smaller companies they could do deals with, and in the south there's the incentive is much higher because there's lots of oil. So these companies are interested in long-term investment, but because of the poor management on the side of Iraq, it's really the socialist mind and the Ministry of Oil and so on and so forth. They don't take into interest the legitimate interest of these oil companies,
Yes.
more or less. And these oil companies decide to leave, and then you have the Russians and the Chinese. And usually the Russian and less the Russian, more the Chinese. The Chinese come up with influence, with political influence. Their model that has worked in Africa and in Asia and Africa. The worst is that you get the nation in a debt trap.
Yes. And on this matter, because the money is kind of controlled by the U.S. in Iraq, China has invested a lot in Iraq infrastructure, like you've said, or the oil companies. Does the money goes to Iraqis funds or the U.S. funds? Since there's kind of like, I don't know how to explain, but since the U.S. control, it kind of means that the U.S. has the access to the Iraqis funds. The money is in the U.S., if I'm not wrong.
Well, this has lots of technicalities. The way it works, Iraq has two sorts of money in the U.S. One is what's called the reserve, Federal Reserves. I mean, it's like Iraq's money, like lots of countries, Russia, even China, lots of countries put their reserve money in the U.S. because it's protected, it's blah, blah, blah. You could make money out of it. It's protected by law. And this gives the U.S. leverage over lots of countries. I mean, Iraq is trying to diversify, put something in France, something in, but mostly this is in the U.S. That's one thing that's different. And there is the oil money.
Yes.
When Iraq sells oil, this goes into an account in New York, and then Iraq transfers this money to the Central Bank of Iraq. And it's protected because it is American, more or less American money. From the central bank, Iraq could pay, or well, it's complex. They have Rashid al-Rafidain banks.
Yes.
Could not work internationally because they have sanctions on them. So the other one is that, what is it, TBI? So
Yeah.
Iraq pays these countries through TBI based on the circumstances of each. So basically, there are no Chinese companies, for example, that had cases against Iraq with court orders of freezing accounts. So you could send it to China. Okay, you don't have a problem there. So Iraq has ways of paying. That's not so much the problem. If this order is removed or it is or if it expires, there might be problems. We will not know the problems until they occur because we don't know the cases. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Yes.
Yeah. And we're also curious about, in terms of the US's presence in Iraq, of course, in the beginning, it was primarily militarily, and we're wondering how it's evolved over the years. And right now, if you could elaborate on how its presence economically, and if there's influence in terms of political engagements.
Well, I think the U.S. ambitions has lessened a great deal about Iraq, from thinking of Iraq as a strategic ally, okay, to a burden, more or less, okay. The initial U.S. Hope for Iraq is that you build a vibrant democracy with a strong economy that essentially becomes a Western ally, a reliable Western ally. Much of this did not happen. Iraq is a lot more under the influence of Iran than the influence of the US in certain respects, not in all respects. But so the US, I think what's happening in the US, there's what we call historical fatigue. They're tired of Iraq, more or less. Lots of money was poured into Iraq. Lots of Americans died in Iraq, and they don't have a reliable ally in the political class in Iraq. That's simply the case. And so the reduced ambition is that to do two things: not allow Iraq to turn into a breeding ground for terrorist groups, Qaeda, ISIS. You should never give them a space where they could train, organize, and more or less target the West or target the national states in the region because this will have a ripple effect, so on and so forth. That's what we discovered from 9/11. They had a place in Afghanistan, they could do all of this damage. The second, so that's the first goal, and that's more or less realized, achieved. ISIS doesn't have a foothold in Iraq where it could train and organize and does lots of things. The second is not allowing Iran to take over Iraq. So not allowing Iraq to be part of the axis of resistance, or just under the thumb of Iran, and that's a more difficult one. The U.S. is using sanctions, threats, so on and so forth. But the other aspect of this is that U.S. governments or U.S. administrations are usually invested in Iraq's national governments. With the exception of Abdul Mahdi's government, I don't think they had any hope in it, because it went directly the Iran-Chinese axis at the time. Because the government, any government in Iraq, would deal with practicalities of governance and the problems and this, they don't find it in their own interest to basically deal with Iran, because it's very costly to deal with Iran. Iran is one of the most heavily sanctioned nations in the world. You lose a lot by doing deals with it. So, I mean, these are the tools, and I think this executive order is also one of the tools. A much reduced ambition compared to the past. Iraq is a vibrant democracy with a strong economy, a Western ally, into the current Iraq, which is more or less anti-American,
Yes.
pro-Iran, and sectarian. You basically have a sectarian system of government, regardless of what they say in the media.
And on that matter, we've seen that the US are kind of involved military, but they were also the leader of the international coalition in 2014, 2017, and the international coalition is about to leave Iraq soon. Does it mean that it will have 100% US military presence, or does the international coalition will continue to stay, or are there any other ideas for the US to control military, I guess, Iraq in these circumstances in case of ISIS comes back or so on? I
mean, the international coalition will continue to exist outside Iraq. I don't think it has really much of an existence in Iraq. I mean, after Mosul was liberated and Iraq dismantled some of it deliberately. The commission about following up on the Yazidis and the genocide. Iraq ended it, actually, because the commission refused to hand Iraq information. Iraq has, death sentence, and so anyhow, legal issues. But what is happening in Iraq, I think, is just a change in names. Really, nothing. The U.S. troops will stay. They will call it something else. Consultants or advisors and so on and so forth. And that's a political decision. And Iran and the armed groups have more or less agreed to it. It's a compromise between the coordination framework and the U.S. The U.S. would accept the coordination framework governing Iraq. This is a pro-Iran group, and after the fight, the political fight they have with the Sadr, they wanted some legitimacy, and the U.S. did allow this in return for, don't target us, don't do this, and I think the deal has gone through. Gaza challenged the whole deal. The war in Gaza challenged the whole deal, and the armed groups wanted to more or less undo the deal. Well, not necessarily undo the deal, but not go by its terms without expecting consequences from the U.S. But the U.S. responded very vigorously, when it assassinated one of them, a couple of leaders. And so the deal is back. Everybody is going by the terms of the deal. That's the truth of the matter.
Okay.
And I suppose now we'd like to just transition to the recent meeting that took place between President Biden and Prime Minister Soudani.
Yes.
And so we were wondering if you believe that the extension of the mandate kind of speaks to how Washington perceives Iraq's fragility in the current moment, and what the future holds for U.S.-Iraq relations in general.
Well, the rhetoric that the government used is a good one, is a useful one, if it follows through the Iraqi government. I mean, this is, I think, the first Qadimi government did use some of this rhetoric, but this government is putting a lot more effort. They're talking about the activation of the strategic framework agreement. This is a very ambitious agreement, has a lot in it that benefits Iraq, but it has been sitting, collecting dust, more or less. It's only the military aspect that they deal with. It has, deals, I think, with 7 sectors: energy, the economy, blah, blah, blah. Now, this government is saying, no, we should activate this, and this is our strategy. And it sent a very big delegation, Washington. The visit was basically 2 days, but they stayed the official side of it. But then they stayed, 4 other days. It's because they went and talked to U.S. companies in the context of activating this strategic agreement. Now, if Iraq does actually do this, meaning work on this agreement in a strategic way, have priorities in all of the sectors that the agreement deals with, and follow up on these with the practical steps, yes, this could be a significant turnaround. But I highly doubt that this will happen, because if you follow up, it means you'll have to do lots of reforms that cannot go in Iraq. I mean, you have armed groups, you have they would not want these things to, automating things, lots of things where basically the agreement would mean you dismantle the rentier state in Iraq.
Yes.
And there'll be lots of pushback. I mean, one reason that these political parties, these armed groups are strong, because they live off state revenues, employment, and they use them to bribe the people, bribe the society. When you take this away from them, they have nothing. So I don't think this will work out.
So what are your ideas or expectations to what Iran has been very involved in Iraq since so many years, and now saying that the U.S. has once more renewed this order, is it going to affect the relationship between Iraq and Iran? The fact that there's also the death of the president, we don't know if the new president is going to follow the lead of keeping Iraq, or they're going to deal with whatever happened internally. So what is the impact for Iran's influence?
I mean, Iran would want to see this executive order continue. Because this allows Iraq to pay it money, and there are technicalities that Iran would not want to see Iraq sink, because that would turn Iraq into a burden on it. And it doesn't want this. It wants Iraq that functions, that has money, so it could utilize it as a market for its commodities. Iranian commodities are not competitive by international standards, but they get sold in Iraq easily because you have a political class that allows this. It's sympathetic to Iran's ambitions in this regard. About Raisi or about the new president, I don't think any Iranian president would affect much Iran's policy in Iraq, because Iran's policy in Iraq, the more significant part of it, is run by the Revolutionary Guard. And the Revolutionary Guard is run by the office of the Supreme Leader. So it's different. I don't think it would affect. They have a voice. The presidency has a voice in the national security establishment or the council, because the president leads that. But what the National Security Council, the Iranian National Security Council, does is that more or less presents choices to the supreme leader. So I don't think the president would affect the policy much.
And lastly, to conclude, what are your opinions on this order? Do you believe that this order is great for Iraq, that we should continue with this order, or do you believe that Iraq should dissociate itself from this order and work on its own?
I mean, the ideal situation is Iraq should not use this order, meaning it's the need for it has to end by Iraq settling all of these cases and having a normal operating, financial system that doesn't need, the protection of a superpower with whom, if you disagree one day, you could lose the protection. It's an emergency situation, more or less, and Iraq doesn't seem to care because it has failed to prioritize or to see that someday they might not have this protection. So it's a lopsided situation that I think will continue, and probably the U.S. would want it to continue to use it as a pressure tool some point in time.
Okay.
And it has used it once.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for the insights that you've given us. They're very appreciated. And thank you for taking the time out of your schedule as well to speak to us. So that concludes our questions.
Yes, thank you so much. That was very interesting, and I love learning more about Iraq through your eyes. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Have a good day. Enjoy.
Thank you, you too. Bye.
Bye.